that's okay.
All right, I'm just going to give everyone a few minutes to join us, and then I'll kick us off. Katie, sorry, I feel like you're the main view here, so I'll try to
Me?
Yeah, well, at least on my screen. So
Oh, that's too big.
all right. Well, I might just kick off, and then the other people can join us as we kind of do introductions. But hello and welcome to today's webinar, hosted by the Centre for Women's Safety and Wellbeing in partnership with Sexual Assault Services Victoria. My name's Jess. I'm the manager of the sexual violence pillar here at the Centre for Women's Safety and Wellbeing. But before I go any further, I'd really like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners. I'm coming from Whadjuk Noongar Boodja here in Perth, but I'd like to acknowledge that we have people from all across WA and Australia today. So I'd really like to pay deep respects to elders of all generations who continue to protect, promote culture and country from wherever you're coming from today. And we are in Reconciliation Week, so I think it's really important to acknowledge the theme this year, which is bridging the past and the future. This theme to me is really a call to action, from moving from words to meaningful action. And I think in WA, we finally this week have seen a reparations scheme being announced for the living members of the stolen generations, which is really long overdue. And for many, it comes far, far too late. But nonetheless is a really important step for many people here in WA. We know that there is more work to do, and there has to be a commitment to truth-telling, healing and reconciliation. And I think working in the sexual violence space, we have to be recognising those past injustice inflicted on First Nations people and how that impacts our work, and that colonisation continues today and needs to really be central in everything that we do. So we've got really important opportunities in the work we do to really champion, amplify the voice of First Nations people in everything that we do. I would also really like to acknowledge the strength and resilience of adults, children and young people who have experienced domestic, family and sexual violence, and would really like to pay respects to those who did not survive, and acknowledge family, friends and communities who have lost loved ones to this very preventable and far-reaching issue. For those of you who don't know us, we're the Centre for Women's Safety and Wellbeing is the peak body for the specialist family, domestic violence, sexual assault and community-based women's health services in Western Australia. And Sexual Assault Services Victoria is the peak body for the specialist sexual assault and harmful sexual behaviours services in Victoria. It's really fantastic to have SASVIC here with us today to share some really important and really interesting learnings from a trip that they took towards the end of last year to look at some of the international responses to sexual violence. I think we're all really excited to find out more about how other places are doing things, and I think that recognition about how sharing other approaches and initiatives and learnings from other places can really help us think about what is possible here in Australia to improve responses and prevention of sexual violence. So I'll take this opportunity to introduce our really fantastic speakers from SASVIC. So we've got Kathleen Maltzan, who's the SASVIC CEO, Amy Webster, Policy Advocacy and Research Manager, and Katie Murphy, Learning Design and Training Team Leader. There will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of this, so please just pop them into the chat and we will get to them after the SASVIC team kind of go through their presentation. But with that, we're really here to hear from them. So I'll hand over to the team and we can go from there.
Thanks, Jess. I'll kick off. I think Katie, Amy and I are all meeting on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So pleased to pay respect past and present as we start. So thank you so much, Jess, for the invitation and everyone who's here. We are very conscious that we were pretty lucky to do the study tour and so keen to share it with you. And I should say we did invite someone from WA and a range of other people, but it was our first one. And so we probably did it more hurriedly than we might do it again. And so we didn't end up having anyone from WA. But we really, as Jess sort of suggested, wanted to do something to see what was happening in the rest of the world. And I don't know about you, but we came out of COVID having, in our case, having been locked down. There's been such a huge focus in Victoria on family violence and a lot of talking about how what we're doing is the best in the world. And came out of that period as SASVIC was just starting, we're not quite 5 years old, going, wouldn't it be good to see what was happening outside Victoria, outside Australia? And our board really supported the idea of doing a study tour. And so this was our first study tour. We'll talk through where we went and what we did in a minute, but we had representatives from 12 representatives from Sexual Assault Services Victoria members. So all the specialist sexual assault services in Victoria are members, as you guess from the name, and most of them essentially could send 1 or 2 people. We had the 3 of us from SASVIC. We had 2 colleagues from the Victorian Aboriginal Community and Childcare and Community Association, VACA, and a colleague, an academic from Queensland, Dr. AJ George, who is quite involved in some of the ALRC or Attorney General committees around the ALRC report. So mainly Victorians from our sector, but a little bit of a mix. Katie, let's go on to the next slide. So we'll sort of talk through a little bit about where we went, but we started in London, in England. We then split into a couple of groups and went to Brighton and to Cardiff in Wales. Again, in 2 groups to Ireland and Iceland. We joined back up in Stockholm in Sweden, and then went to Brussels and ended up at the Council of Europe in Strasbourg in France. So it was quite a sort of quick tour. We had sort of 2 nights in many places, but yeah, really got to see quite a sweep of what was happening in Europe. So we started with the Child and Women Abuse Studies Unit. Some of you will know Liz Kelly or Fiona Vera Gray, who comes and teaches with us every year, and they brought together like a really big group of sexual assault sector, not quite government, academics, a whole lot of other people working. Now, this is where I'm going to do a slightly embarrassing thing and just check with Amy and Katie whether I'm speaking to this one or whether you are.
That's Amy.
Sorry, off you go, Amy.
Hi everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Jess and Kathleen. It's a real pleasure to be with you all online this afternoon. It was a real privilege to be part of the study tour last year with SASFIC, and hopefully we can share some learnings that'll be of interest and relevance to your work. I am starting off by talking about justice navigators. So in 2023-24, SASFIC successfully campaigned for a Justice Navigators pilot in Victoria. And the model we proposed was very much informed by reports and evaluations that we had read about of the independent sexual violence advisor roles that have been operating across England and Wales since around 2007. And so these roles was obviously specifically about supporting survivors of sexual violence. And we have just embarked on the early stages of the design process of the pilot in Victoria. Our hope is that as we refine the design through this early process, that over time, the Justice Navigators in Victoria will support survivors to understand and exercise their rights within the complex and punitive legal and justice system that we have, help survivors to navigate all the support, compensation, justice and recovery options available to them, taking a really broad survivor-led approach to what justice might mean or include for different people. Could be the civil or criminal justice system, but it could be things like apologies or employment or housing justice as well. We're planning that Justice Navigators would be available to support survivors for as long as support is needed, noting how long those processes can take, and that they'll support and build the capacity of the specialist sexual assault sector and counsellor advocates and other professionals and sectors, including police and courts as well, to improve responses to survivors generally. So one of the real highlights of the tour was hearing directly and also informally from real life ISVAs about the key design, recruitment and practice considerations that they have learnt through the 10 plus years they've been operating. And although the ISVA model is very well evaluated and you can find lots of evaluations online, there were a bunch of really important things that weren't written down, so it was really good to hear those directly from ISVAs. I'm just going to briefly go over a few of those considerations for you now, the ones that aren't really written down anywhere, and if you'd like to hear more, we can talk more at the end with the question time. But one of the things we learned was about eligibility. So it's really important that a survivor doesn't have to make a report to police or be an existing sexual assault service client in order to access a Justice Navigator. We also heard about recruitment. Usually ISVAs are social workers or counsellors rather than lawyers. We heard about the importance of valuing lived experience of the legal or justice processes related to sexual and family violence. We also heard that often the best justice navigators are those that don't mind being unpopular with police in particular. And it was highlighted that a productive tension is a sign that a justice navigator is having influence with the police. In terms of timelines and caseloads, we heard about, the need to anticipate potentially overwhelming demand. The specialist sexual assault sector in Victoria sees around 20,000 survivors a year already, and demand for ISVAs is really characterised by intermittent contact with the Justice Navigator or ISVA over quite long periods of time. At the time we went on the study tour, it was around 840 days on average in the UK between a police report and a court outcome, and that wait has actually gotten longer with increasing demand in the UK. We also heard about some really important pitfalls to avoid. In particular, we were told that justice navigators can be held up as a panacea to the many failings of the police and justice system in relation to responding to sexual violence. But the reality is that justice navigators alone will not be able to transform the justice system, and therefore kind of risks what becoming becoming what the ISVAs we spoke to described as messengers for a profoundly broken system. So in order to make sure that doesn't happen, a raft of other complementary measures are also necessary to help maximise results from the operation of the pilot. Very quickly, these include more wider police reform. So in the UK, ISVAs are complemented by Operation Soteria, which is a kind of revolution in the way that the police approach sexual violence offences, that's victim-centred, suspect-focused and context-led. Using the Justice Navigators to create templates that are not only useful for the few survivors that will be able to access them directly, particularly in the pilot phase, but templates that can be used or accessed by all survivors. So, for example, if Justice Navigators can work with police to create templates when they're communicating why cases have been dropped and what other options survivors might have. We also learnt about a portal in the UK, which is a real-time online portal for investigations and court updates called the Citizens Portal, where survivors can log on directly and find out what's happening with their case. And we heard about what they call in the UK CHISVs, so Children's Independent Sexual Violence Advocates or Advisors, but also Justice Navigators in our context that would focus on particular cohorts that have particular justice barriers or issues. So you could have a Justice Navigator with expertise on disability. You could have a Justice Navigator that was based in an Aboriginal community controlled organisation. So just a recent update, we advocated strongly to the ALRC that Justice Navigators could be picked up nationally. Labor made that election commitment before they won the election, and so we do have a national justice system navigator pilot being rolled out, and we're keeping a close eye on that one and how it can be integrated with the one in Victoria and what the differences and similarities might be. So happy to take questions later on, but we'll hand back to my colleagues now.
That's me, Amy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Barnahouse, and we're hopping around a little bit, but just to give you some context around Barnahouse, which is direct translation is Children's House. So it's a model developed in Alabama in the USA, and the service addresses sexual abuse, physical abuse, family violence, and unaccompanied minors who have been subject to child sexual exploitation and human trafficking. We visited two Barnahouses, one in Iceland and the other in Stockholm. The first Barnahouse was set up in Iceland in 1998, so it brings under one roof all relevant professionals. For example, the judge, the prosecutor, the police, social workers, and medical professionals such as psychologists and forensic doctors. So in order to obtain from the child victim of sexual abuse the necessary information for investigation and court proceedings, and also to help the child by preventing re-traumatization and providing support, including medical and therapeutic assistance. It's a one physical child-friendly space. Everyone comes to the child there. The child doesn't attend the court and is not interviewed by police at a police station. Only the children's worker has direct contact, and everyone else will observe the recording, and questions are filtered through the person in the room with the child. The one in Stockholm services around 1.2 million people, and Iceland is a much smaller space, on a much smaller scale, as Iceland's got a population of around 400,000 people, so quite small. A variety of assessments are completed by the clinicians at Barnahouse, so including investigative interviews, exploratory interviews, medical examinations, survivor assessments and counselling, and family counselling and support and consultations to other services. So I guess when we visited both Barnahouses, I suppose what impressed us most was the idea that the child was central. The services The service is mobilised to meet the needs of the child or the young person. Forensic interviews are completed by Barnahouse clinicians with the law enforcement, criminal justice parties, magistrate, child protection, and sometimes the director of immigration, which is a bit of an issue up in Iceland and Sweden. So all can be present observing the interview through a one-way mirror. With the clinician wearing an earpiece and questions from services interwoven as part of the forensic interview. The child or the young person is totally aware of the process. So in Stockholm, which is this picture here, the building, we were delighted to follow the kids' step laid out on the floor to help children navigate the different rooms, including the waiting room, the police room, and the social services room. So in that particular visit, we met with the coordinator of social services, a psychiatrist, a pediatrician, and the police. So in that particular service, which was quite a large building, there's 7 coordinators, 4 crisis counsellors, 80 police officers. That also includes investigators and administration staff, 4 nurses, 4 doctors, 3 public prosecutors, and 20 officers and 6 psychiatrists. So quite a huge amount of staff in there. So their mantra is that they always have the best interest of the children. And in each room, they have a map displayed that illustrates the journey that a child might expect when they enter it. It describes the rooms they'll move through. Go back. That they'll move through and the people they'll meet along the way and what to expect and how it'll all work together to support them. They cited the CRC, which is the Conventions in Swedish law, which is Article 3. The most important is the best interests of the child, and Article 12, which is the child has the right to express themselves and to be heard. And they expect that when a child enters a Barnahouse and when they leave, they should be much better off. The Barnahouses in Sweden are all, because it's quite a larger area, they're all quite developed differently depending on the local conditions and are funded by taxpayers' money. So a typical case, I'll just run you through how it might look, is that a child will tell someone that they trust about the abuse. Social services call and consults the coordinator. A police report is sent to Barnahouse. A multidisciplinary team meeting takes place. A child forensic interview is conducted. The professionals will listen in to the monitor room. The forensic medical examination is carried out. There's also an ambition to have the adult on the same day, and then crisis support becomes available. So I suppose they believe the success of the model relies totally on the collaboration between all teams. They believe that the child should be in charge, and they show them their rooms when they enter, as you've seen in the previous picture. There's a policy of no uniforms in the building, which means the children aren't traumatized by any past experience of people in uniforms. And specially trained staff conduct the forensic interviews, and they're always recorded. There's also support available afterwards to inform, support, and follow up afterwards. So this could be information meeting with parents, a home visit, a follow up, and feedback given. I guess the other aspect that we were impressed was that the police's role in helping children, sometimes years later down the track, to understand why the people who harmed them were not put in prison. So giving them some information around the legal processes and hearing it directly from the police was very meaningful to everybody involved. So we can leave questions at the end, and I'm happy to just show a few of our pictures there again. So I'll hand it back to Amy.
Thanks, Katie. I'm now going to talk briefly about a couple of other gems we brought back with us. The first one is contextual safeguarding. So the contextual safeguarding framework was developed by UK academic Carleen Furman, who's on the screen, and it's an approach to understanding and responding to the harm that children and young people experience outside of their families, such as in peer groups or schools or in communities. contextual safeguarding complements traditional child protection work and also kind of provides a bit of an alternative to it by focusing on the social and physical environments where harm can occur. The framework emphasises targeting the context of harm rather than solely focusing on problematising or criminalising individual children's behaviours. So SASPIC has, subsequent to the tour, partnered with our colleagues at VACA, and we're bringing Carleen out to Australia later this year, and we're really looking forward to focusing on what contextual safeguarding can contribute to responses to kids, particularly Aboriginal kids or kids in out-of-home care. But there's also, we reckon, quite a lot of potential to take some of the kind of key components of contextual safeguarding and apply them to kind of primary prevention for child sexual exploitation, but also potentially for the abuse of older people as well. Because it's a really interesting framework. I think I'm going straight on now. Yep, to talk just about another idea we brought back with us, which is about anonymous data. So one of the observations that we had was that several services, including the ones on the screen now in Reykjavik, that we visited, provided confidential and anonymous web chat and phone services, particularly for children and young people. And they don't collect any identifying data from the children and young people through those web chats. And that was kind of a deliberate strategy so that they could sidestep any mandatory reporting requirements, so mandatory reporting to police or child protection. And they felt that was, they experienced that meant that a lot more children and young people would contact them and sort of test the waters and build trust with the organisation, and then over time potentially provide identifying information, but not initially. So Stigomot in Iceland and Tjurhus in Stockholm both run anonymous phone lines and web chat for children and young people experiencing family violence, intimate partner violence or sexual violence. And both services spoke about how this approach was really deliberate and how they felt it was consistent with their feminist values, and that had resulted in more children and young people reaching out for help. So that's probably a challenging kind of one for us to get our head around, at least in Victoria, where there are so many kind of risk-focused requirements when you work with children and young people. So this was, kind of a surprising thing to hear about. I think now I'm going to hand over to Kathleen.
I think you go first.
Oh,
Amy,
I go first.
on
Apologies.
The Nordic paradox.
Cool. So this was something that personally was a big highlight for me about the trip. So probably many or most or all of you will be familiar with what's called the Nordic paradox. It's a phenomenon that's received a lot of attention and discussion in Australia and internationally. It refers to the question of why Nordic countries such as Sweden and Iceland, which are by some measures some of the most gender equal places in the world, continue to report persistently high rates of violence against women. And many academics all over the world are still trying to find out the answer to this, because as you will be aware, the main kind of frameworks that we have for primary prevention of violence against women and family violence in Australia kind of rely on the belief that if gender equality improves, violence will decrease. While academics have looked at this, it was really a great opportunity to talk to the people in these countries about what they thought the explanation was for the Nordic paradox. And they provided us with a bunch of insights, some of which do not appear in any of the literature that I have looked at before. So it was pretty exciting. So some of those insights were that there are really high levels of reporting and awareness of your rights and confidence in police responses around violence against women and sexual violence in those countries. For example, in Sweden, 84% of the population reports having confidence in the authorities' response, which makes it much more likely that victims will come forward and make a complaint. I think that would be much higher than in Australia. They also spoke about the fact that gender equality in terms of things like education and political empowerment and economic participation, which sometimes are referred to as kind of the formal measures of gender equality, doesn't and won't trickle down to the interpersonal level without targeted effort. So this is particularly the case where there is a strong cultural emphasis on personal privacy, which is the case in Iceland and also in Sweden. So you can have lots of really public focus on gender equality in workplaces and really good laws potentially, but it may not like trickle down or won't trickle down to that family kind of or intimate partner level unless you take a really targeted and deliberate approach to addressing things like privacy. They also observed that in Iceland, for example, they have really gender equal laws or laws that look really kind of gender equal on paper, but they're not actually gender equitable. So they have, for example, the presumption of shared like equal custody of children post-separation. And, you know, we've just stopped having that in Australia because we, you know, understand that that actually disadvantages the non-violent partner, the non-offending parent, who is most often the mother. They also spoke about the existence or legacy of other forms of inequality that drive violence, so temporary visa status, regional isolation, homophobia, experiences of child abuse, and how they drive violence against women separate to gender inequality. And finally, and I think this one is probably the most familiar explanation, they talked about how perpetrators find violence against women to be more necessary in more gender equal societies in order to maintain or reassert control and dominance, which is, you know, what we would normally call the backlash effect. So I'll hand back to Kathleen now.
Thanks, Amy. One of the things that we were interested in finding out about was feminist self-defense. And I think probably over the last 3 or 4 years of SASFIC's existence, we've been in particularly Victorian government forums talking about primary prevention or about prevention that then becomes a conversation about primary prevention and is sort of very much reflecting the thinking Amy was talking about, that the main thing, you know, fundamental thing to do is to change gendered inequality, which certainly SASFIC agrees with, but sometimes then in terms of government programs doesn't go much beyond there. And we knew from prior conversations that in a number of parts of Europe, they're using feminist self-defense, which is clearly a very, very different approach from the approach we use here. And in Victoria, at least, there used to be feminist self-defense, and it really sort of petered out in the 2000s because of a critique that it was individualizing, that it was blaming the victim by saying that you had to, you know, defend yourself, that it was dangerous. Nonetheless, as I say, a whole lot of places in Europe still have feminist self-defense, and in fact, as we came to learn, the evidence base is really strong. So we met with people from an organisation called Garance in Brussels that works in the French-speaking part of Brussels, and a group of young women from Poland. And in Poland, they have rolled out feminist self-defense with something like 100,000 girls and young women. And what they say is that it operates on a whole lot of levels. So part of what they're doing is really changing, in this case, women and girls' sort of socialisation, addressing a whole lot of the myths that women and girls will have around violence, and doing work really that helps women be clear-eyed about their rights or know their rights and be clear about indicators of violence, etc. And although the sort of perception is, you know, maybe a whole lot of kung fu going on, 80% of what they do is this sort of consciousness raising and talking. 10% is verbal self-defense and 10% is physical. What do you do if all the other things fail? And we were really introduced to what is increasingly very strong evidence base. So, for example, in Canada, there's been a whole lot of work done on feminist self-defense in university campuses, and although we generally would often be critical about those sort of North American research trials that are based in unis because that sort of skews the demographic, of course, young women are a very obvious group that you do want to know about in terms of prevention. And they're finding, for example, that sexual assaults have halved with the group of women and girls who undertook the training, that effect lasts for 2 years. There are also fewer attempted or completed rapes, that where there's this whole question that used to be about, oh, if you fight back, you'll get hurt. And what they've found is that women do get hurt in the context of rape attempts where they've fought back, but usually what happens is they fight back because they've been hurt. So the sort of old data saying that you got injured was correct in that women were injured, but wasn't because of the sexual violence. And they're also finding, really interestingly, and they talked about this quite a lot when we were there, that women and girls are have more specific fear but less generalized fear, and that they're better at essentially seeing situations where men were being violent to them and saying, you know, essentially saying, doing things that were protective because they, in a sense, had validation that they're entitled to protect themselves. They're entitled to say to men they couldn't continue certain type of behaviour. And that where women were raped, they blamed themselves less. And finally, that where women and girls were already survivors of sexual violence, it was actually a really helpful form of recovery, in part because it gave them an opportunity to make meaning of what had happened to them, to feel less isolated, to understand the sort of systemic factors that had allowed them to be raped. I mean, all the same stuff that those of you who are counsellor advocates or equivalent will be doing one-on-one, but this is group-based. So we're really interested in that, and we've got a bit of funding from the Victorian government at the moment to look at what prevention looks like for sexual violence, and I think we will explore more, amongst many other things, the role of feminist self-defense. Who's next? I'm next.
Yeah.
One of the other things that many of us who went on the study tour were really struck by was how strong a sense there was of people in the sexual assault sector thinking of themselves as activists, framing what they did in terms of rights, being really explicit in their language, including, you know, talking explicitly about rape a lot, whereas I think we observed that maybe our language has become sort of more generic and polite. And one of the things that was really interesting to learn about was that the Council of Europe, which is sort of a parallel organisation to the European Union, but focused on rights, human rights essentially. They have a whole range of conventions, and 2 of them are relatively new. One, called the Lanzarote Convention, is around child sexual abuse and child sexual exploitation. The second, that they refer to as the Istanbul Convention, because that's where it was, the text it was sort of agreed to, is on family violence and violence against women. And the way, and what they said is that those conventions are much stronger essentially than the UN conventions that are similar. And the conventions work in a couple of ways, well, a range of ways, but the two sort of important things are that each state is essentially assessed against the convention. So an independent committee will go to the country, it will receive reports both from the government and from civil society. So everywhere we went, the services were sometimes spending a lot of time preparing information to give to the committees. And in fact, they said it was a bit of a burden, but nonetheless with some important outcomes. That committee then writes a report describing any issues, sort of positive and negative, and then they give it to a committee made up of government representatives. And that group of representatives from all the state parties comes up with recommendations. And so one of the things that they said was really interesting is that essentially we are not in these two conventions, but say Australia was a member, we'd have someone there, everyone would be discussing us, we'd be in the room. So we could sort of negotiate what went in, so states don't get sort of necessarily damning recommendations. But there is this whole sort of peer pressure to improve what you're doing. So for the Children's Convention, it's led to the Barnhuses that Katie mentioned earlier, sort of spreading across Europe and Scandinavia. And the Council of Europe has a much bigger membership, a broader membership than the European Union. And in the case of the Family Violence and Violence Against Women Convention, it's led to many things, but including moving to affirmative consent in many countries. So everywhere we went, people framed things around rights, children's rights, human rights, women's rights, which I think we do much less of, and they use the international human rights mechanisms that are there, and particularly these ones. And the thing that was sort of interesting about that for us is that although they're European conventions, anyone can join, any state can join. Australia is party to the Convention on Cybersecurity, which is a sort of sibling convention to the Kids Sexual Abuse and Sexual Exploitation Committee. And although I don't think sort of overnight Australia is going to sign up to something like that, I do think there's an interesting conversation to have about sort of pushing our government to think more about conventions like that and having a more transparent sort of process for judging them against the international human rights conventions we've already signed up to. And of course, that's not a new thing in Australia, but I feel like it's much, much weaker than it was, say, in the 80s and maybe even 90s. So that was really interesting. And one of the things, and the photos up here show us now, was we were really interested to meet in the European Parliament, and then more generally a whole lot of migrant women's organisations, or as they say in the UK, Black and Majority World women's organisations, really looking at the intersections between violence against women, racism, etc., including in the context of the rise of the racist right in Europe. I think I may have covered that without the slides. So yeah, across particularly in the UK, we met, and not only the UK, met with a number of specific, as I would say in the UK, either they'd say by and for organisations or Black and Majority World organisations. And I certainly came away thinking more about how SASFIC, as a mainstream, relatively well-funded organisation, could better back immigrant women's organisations and amplify their work, and also think about concretely how we get more resources into them.
This is me, Kathleen. So I guess to go back, just go back there. When we began our study tour at KWAZU, which is the Child and Women's Studies Unit, you saw the picture at the very start. The initial discussion focused on the benefits of creating space for strategic and campaigning contexts for influencing action to address and prevent sexual violence. So a framework for creating change was discussed throughout the couple of days that we were there. During which feminist movements were described not as waves, that probably oversimplifies the complex, multifaceted nature of feminism, but as a tapestry that incorporates intersectional approaches and brings the feminist history reflexively woven into its present. So some of the key things we took from our few days in England, in the UK, was activism is part of healing after violence and being able to act in the world. Violence is difficult to be seen in public, and we need to change how we campaign and create alignment. We also discussed and examined whether movements to prevent sexual violence had lost the we and lost connections with survivors along the way. Even though many people working in the services brought their own lived experience to the work, the question was posed to us about how do we position ourselves in relation to the category of survivor and how do we speak out from that position. We also discussed the benefit and value of experiential knowledge. So, and the place of activism in work to address sexual violence. So specifically how to be radical in speech, advocacy and lobbying without shouting, and how to know when the time and the places to shout and raise your voice. The history of movements, fighting for freedoms was touched on a little bit, and a reminder that campaigns for women's vote was the means to end male violence against women. So our discussion considered what people are willing to do for change. So noting that movements have centers and edges and people have different tactics, but nevertheless seek to achieve the same goals. So some things that we took out of our visit to the Child and Women's Abuse Study Unit was making sure different voices are heard. So having a bright idea and the mapping of the gaps, find feminists wherever you are, be useful to politicians and policymakers, be strategic. What do we need? How do we get them to listen? Always have a campaign plan. And remember your roots, so bringing people's experiences back to the centre. We also discussed the importance of coalition building and strategizing, which included making more time to think, to plan, to identify common priorities and changing the way how campaigns are run, and amplifying the voice of smaller groups and creating a space to be radical. I did have a little graphic up there, but it seemed to have disappeared. I don't know where, from a little website from a group called Ending Violence Against Women. So we did hear from them, and they're a coalition about successful campaigns and strategic litigation opportunities that led to system and legislative improvements in the UK. So useful insights on the importance of finding opportunities to influence on advocacy issues, developing relationships, and on engaging with politicians and journalists were also shared. Amongst many campaigns that they're involved with at the moment is one led by the coalition that focuses on Rape Justice Now. So to achieve a justice system that is fair and equal and attain better support for survivors. And data on rape survivors' experiences of policing has been published. And they were also working with high-end magazines such as Glamour on campaigning and weaving storylines into public culture TV, such as EastEnders. Maybe some of your listeners here from WA might be familiar with the show. So they were some of the things they were doing. I'm just going to touch a little bit on volunteering before we finish up. So another common feature across many services that we visited that differed to Australia was a reliance on volunteers among the workforce. and engagement with survivors. So in volunteer strategies and in centering lived experience in activism and campaigns. So for example, in Dublin and also in England, volunteers are core to service delivery with the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, having 60 volunteers who enable them to run their helpline and other services. So volunteers receive high quality intensive training. They do 3 months probation, and then they have to commit to volunteering for 2 years. I guess one thing for us is that we recognise the need to incorporate volunteers and volunteering back into everything that we do, and have a role to play in working and developing our survivors to empower them to make real and meaningful changes. I'm just going to leave you with one quote from somebody from the study tour who said, "I was inspired by the amount of work that involves volunteers alongside paid workers. What this means for our work is exciting. We've been too risk averse, bringing in intersectional experience, lived experience, and victim survivors from different backgrounds, and being informed by their knowledge will benefit our work. We need to break down the distinction between professionals and survivors." So I'll leave it there on that. So thank you, everybody. I don't know if Amy and Kathleen want to jump in. I can stop sharing actually, if that's easy.
Not to jump in, but there's a great question from Sharon. Do you want to speak to it, Sharon, or shall I read it out? Or Jess, do you want to do that?
The microphones are turned off for the audience, so I'm happy to read out any questions that come up. So yeah, Sharon has a great question and says, great presentation as well. And I would, reiterate that. The European countries you visited have an inquisitorial rather than adversarial criminal justice system. Did you notice any differences around police and court processes and victim survivor experiences in those inquisitorial jurisdictions? For example, any differences in reporting rates, attrition rates, conviction, and experiences of the process from reporting to police to the trial process. So a big question, but I guess the difference between those two kind of criminal justice systems.
I mean, Katie, do you want to start? Because you saw the Barnahus more and that, like some of the stuff they do there, we just can't do because of that. And then maybe Soteria.
Yeah. I'll start, Katie, if that's cool.
Sure. Yeah,
no worries. So it's a really good question, and there's not really a super simple answer to it. And I'm not an expert on the nuances of like all the different systems in those countries, but a few observations. So certainly reporting is higher in Sweden, and there's a higher conviction rate. But not a hugely higher conviction rate. Attrition rates are really high in the UK, and conviction rates are really low. And that's despite really important things like Justice Navigators and Operation Soteria, which is police doing this big reform to try to improve attrition rates and conviction outcomes, and the explanation for why that wasn't having the outcomes that they were hoping was a couple of things. One, Justice Navigators are kind of, instead of having specialist sexual assault services, or that there is less developed specialist sexual assault services there, but also because of the broader context around like the austerity measures and courts and police really struggling in all areas, and really long times, like wait times between reporting and outcomes. And then in Iceland, my understanding is that their civil and criminal system is combined. So really hard to make like really clear comparisons. Yeah, UK is adversarial, but also has those other factors around the austerity measures as well. So and then attrition rates is tricky as well, because when you look at attrition rates data, it doesn't really tell you where that attrition is coming from, and often we assume that it's survivors dropping out of the process when you take a closer look, it's often police not wanting to proceed with cases as well.
Yeah, I might just jump in and just talk about something that I thought that was really quite obvious was in the Barna houses in both Iceland and in Sweden is the sense of collaboration between everybody involved. And going back to that slide that we put up about the child being at the center, and you know, when a child enters, they should leave it a different experience or a good experience. So it seemed to me, if you compare it to Australia, that everybody seemed to be on the same page, whereas it doesn't really feel like that here in Australia. There's lots of different things going on, and the child or the person involved is the center of attention. So that's the sort of and I guess that maybe works, you know, in those centers.
Maybe just Sharon, to sort of respond to your question, like, I don't think we came back going, oh, we're going to do all those things that we saw, because, as you say, entirely different legal systems and all sorts of things were in place. More, I think in some ways it was a provocation to us. Like, why is it that we can't be sure if kids, you know, notwithstanding the fact that they don't probably have it 100% right, even in the Barna houses, you know, why are we not confident in Victoria, say, that if kids go through a child sexual abuse trial, that it won't be an all right experience for them? You know, the sort of stuff we have about how bad processes are, it's really just helping us think differently about that, I think. And then there were some things that, even though they were very different systems, sometimes sort of arguable potentially. Yeah, so that's just a general comment, I suppose.
Thank you. And thank you, Sharon, for that great question. We have another question from Jasmine. What advice or insights would you offer to service providers or workers whose roles are primarily reactive, responding to incidents of sexual or family violence, who may struggle with feelings of helplessness or frustration that they're not doing enough to prevent violence in the first place? And how effective do you believe awareness and open conversations can be in preventing or addressing this in Australia? It's a big question.
I might start and then Katie and Amy jump in. I think one of the things that really struck us was, I mean, one, I say this is a Victorian, but I think probably even in other parts of Australia, actually how much better funded we were and how much more secure our funding was. And I know in our case in Victoria at the moment is better than other places, so I'm not sort of wanting to say, oh, we've all got it the same, but I would suspect, just from what I know about WA, that it's still better than many of the places we saw. But possibly partly because of that, there was this real sort of fighting spirit in a lot of the places we went to, and this sense of being activists. And, you know, I think that's a tension that we've had in Australia, and in some ways, you know, that's where, at least in Victoria, our services have come out of, and then we've gone through all these complicated professionalising processes, and perhaps we've lost the sense of being fighters, being advocates, being able to say, I mean, I don't presume you all are, but, you know, for me, proudly that I'm a feminist, and it's feminist analysis that makes a difference here, amongst other things, etc. So one of the things that some of us sort of came back thinking about is, how do you go from being a sector to part of a movement? And I think being part of a movement is a way to make sure that individual workers doing hard work, responding to our failure to prevent, you know, how do they feel part of something bigger? So this isn't necessarily an answer to that, but we've certainly been thinking about, in Victoria, most of our members staff are called counsellor advocates, but in many ways the counsellor bit is so much stronger in what people do day to day, and sometimes almost in people's identity. So we sort of factor that into our training in some ways, to sort of reignite that sense that we're all advocates. and sort of give people a way to channel some of the feeling of helplessness and frustration. Not saying these are great solutions, but just things that we're thinking about. And I've got to say, I do believe in awareness raising and open conversation, but I feel pretty unconvinced that a lot of the prevention approaches that we've done in Australia have done enough, given the effort we've given it and the money we've given it. And I'm really interested in us just talking more about regulation, particularly in terms of social media pornography. We didn't explore that a lot when we were overseas, but a little bit. I am interested in things like feminist self-defense. We heard about other more, similarly sort of grassroots stuff, prevention activities that are aimed at children around that. And sort of moving beyond the idea that your attitudes are the primary thing that drives your behaviour. It seems to me that's reasonably simplistic. So some of that comes out of the study tour, some of it's quite separate. I don't know if that answered your question, Jasmine.
Thanks, Kathleen. And I think certainly I've had that reflection too around feeling like we've lost a bit of that feminist fighting spirit sometimes. I feel like that where we've come from has really dissipated a bit, and maybe it's because we've become a bit too professionalized in some ways, which has been a great thing in some ways, but that fighting spirit I feel like is certainly missing, and something that we can put a bit of a call to action to, I think. I've just got a question from Viv here. Why is there such silence and apathy and inaction about sexual violence, and is it worthwhile to demand a Royal Commission into sexual violence and domestic violence in Australia?
I can have a go, and then Amy and Catherine, Katie. Really good question about why there is such silence and apathy and inaction, Viv. I think that there's such an interesting question about similarities and differences between different types of gendered violence, male violence, and all of those of you who do direct work on sexual violence know that it's often and family violence, it's often the last thing said and sometimes never said. And I think it is also, it's the violence that's deployed when nothing else, sort of in a sense in defence of not only but often patriarchal power. And because it's underground, I think it's very easy not to be seen and said. So many more other things, but really recognise the silence and inaction and people's unwillingness to confront sexual violence. I'm pretty ambivalent, I have to say, about something like a Royal Commission. We've had the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. We've had a massive Royal Commission into family violence in Victoria. And I'm just talking about Victoria because that's where we are, not because it's the centre of any sort of world. We're really keen to see it beyond it. And I know things are different in WA. We've had 4 years ago a very good Law Reform Commission report on sexual violence, when we've just had the Australian Law Reform Commission report on sexual violence. And what we see, I feel like what we get is an inquiry, apologies, and no one does anything about or most of the very good recommendations aren't implemented. And so 10 years later or 5 years later, you get another inquiry. So I feel a little like the problem is not that we don't know the problem, we don't know prevalence, we don't know impact. The problem is not that we don't have good recommendations, the problem is government will. So I'm probably more interested in how we could join together across the country to demand action on all the recommendations we've already had.
I agree, Kathleen. Can I jump in there too? Because I've got very fixed ideas about Royal Commissions in that, they've had broad commissions into everything. The commissioner usually earns about 3 million to sit on as a commissioner, and it usually costs about 60 or 65 million to, why why spend that money in a Royal Commission when you know what the problem is, and then put that money into direct services? I personally believe, I mean, there is a bit of an inaction. There's a bit of apathy in a sense in Australia at the moment. People are doing it really tough. Things are just not as they seem. And I do believe that we need to, talking about what we said earlier about getting more active, getting more front facing, running a really strong campaign, demanding more of our government. They're a little bit quiet about stuff, sometimes they're loud, but sometimes they're quiet. So a little bit of action, I think, and put it on people to really address this issue. That's me.
Thanks. Thank you both. And I think I tend to agree. I think, one of the things that struck me from the ALRC report recently, which was really excellent, but quite a few of those recommendations have been made before. And in some ways they've been expanded upon, but I think I'd much rather see action and, that money channeled into service provision and into the evidence that we already have, and then see where we get to from there. But I do think the apathy piece is really stark at the moment, particularly when you think about sexual violence compared to domestic violence, in terms of where that journey has gone. And it's, we're still a long way to go for DV, but the conversation's much more, got a lot more momentum, I think. We've got a comment from Sharon about the tension between there being strong advocates and biting the hand that feeds us, through wanting secure funding through tendering via competitive processes, can make organisations feel restricted in their ability to be fearless and forthright in their advocacy. And I think that pretty much hits the nail on the head through some of that lost activism. And then Daphne's asked if it was mentioned there was a strong evidence base around the feminist self-defence. Is this mainly derived from the places you visited? And is there any way we could share some of that evidence? Great question.
Well, I just dropped some bits and pieces in. So it's partly the places we visited, but they were drawing on a broader evidence base. There's some interesting stuff out of North America. There's some quite strong stuff out of places like Kenya. Interestingly, one of my colleagues and I were just talking to people in New Zealand, because when we were in Brussels, we were talking about, how would you roll this out? And they were going, talk to the New Zealanders, because it turns out in New Zealand there was a whole lot of feminist self-defence done, and in fact quite strongly embedded in schools, and they similarly have pretty good evidence base. And someone sent us some of that last week. I haven't gone through it yet, but I dropped some information in there, and I think where SASVIC, as I say, will probably do a bit more around that, and can let Jess and others know about it when we do. But the evidence was really from all sorts of settings across the world. So rich countries, not rich countries, different types of models. And as I say, mostly pretty good evidence compared to the stuff we're doing at the moment that doesn't really, it's pretty hard to show the evidence that we're succeeding with some of the sort of government-backed approaches to prevention, crime prevention.
Thanks for that, Kathleen. And we can try to share those around with everyone afterwards as well, so it's not lost in the chat post this webinar as well. Thank you for that. Just checking the chat to make sure I haven't missed anything. I don't think so. All right, well, hopefully that's all the questions that people have. But if you do have any questions after this webinar, feel free to send them through to me, and we can see if we can come back to you with any answers offline. But I really want to, really take this opportunity to really thank Kathleen, Amy and Katie for taking the time to really share your experience. We're all very jealous of the trip you went on last year. So we're really thankful for you to sharing that knowledge with us. And I think it just gives us a bit more focus and momentum, on some of the work that's going on at the moment. And, thinking about some of those models that are being explored by governments at the moment, like Justice Navigators, it's really important to have a look at how that's working in some of those other jurisdictions. And I also think that feminist self-defense is a really, really interesting piece of work. So we'll be really keen to keep an eye on what you guys are doing over in Victoria as well.
Can I just jump in and
absolutely
and say something to shamelessly promote what we do? So we mentioned that we do a lot of work with CWAZU and notably Professor Fiona Vera Gray. She's actually from WA, so she's one of your people.
Yeah.
So but she's been in the UK for 20 years, and she runs the masters at the London Metropolitan Museum, Violence Against Women and Girls. So she comes to Melbourne every March now, and she runs like a 6-day condensed version of her masters that she runs. So we run it with her, we facilitate her coming to do it. And if anybody is interested, we've had people from Queensland last year, Northern Territory. So it's becoming a bit more nationally recognised. It's really fantastic. It's 6 days. It goes through all the feminist theory, lots of frameworks, global trafficking, child exploitation, child sexual abuse, pornography, which is what Fiona is. She's written a couple of books on pornography. So I can send the flyer on to you, and maybe if people are interested, they can get in touch with us. And it would be a really good part of your course to do. So thanks for that.
No, thanks, Katie. I think any of those kind of opportunities that come up, we're really keen to hear about, because we get so few and far of them in WA over here. So any that we can kind of share, we're very happy to do so. And it's a learning opportunity for us as well. So thank you.
Yeah, no,
thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And as I said, any questions or follow-ups, just let us know. I've just put what email should we reach
I'm going to
to?
put my email address in the chat. So if people want to get in touch with me about the training course, please just send me a quick email.
Thank you, Katie.
Doing that now. Happy to have a chat with anybody as well and provide more information.
Great, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for making the time, and good luck with the rest of your week. Thank you guys for doing such a kind of late in the day presentation as well, knowing that you're a couple of hours ahead of us. And we look forward to seeing you around in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks,
everybody.
Jess. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for having us, Jess.
Thanks, Kathleen.